Wildlife photography is expensive. Hardly the statement of the year, but worth noting, I guess. Every other photographic discipline you can do on the cheap. You don't need a Leica for street photography, for example, although you won't look the part, and surely that's the whole point. But for wildlife photography, you do kind of need a long lens. You do kind of need a camera that shoots quite quickly, stuff like that. There are equipment requirements that you can't really get away from if you want to have fun doing it. That's why I shoot a very expensive modern setup. But can you do it on the cheap? Well, we're going to find out today. I have here a setup that costs about £500 second hand. We have the Nikon D300s, we have the Nikon 80-400, f4.5 to 5.6D, and I'm going to go and give it a go. I have never really shot this setup. I'm sure it will work fine for static subjects. Will it work for birds in flight? I have absolutely no idea. But it's going to be kind of interesting finding out. It's a lovely day here at Slimbridge. Let's go and give it a go. So the D300s is a 12.3 megapixel camera, which by modern standards is quite low, but it's not too little, it's perfectly usable, especially considering it's a crop sensor camera, so this is more like a 600mm lens in effect. And with modern technology like DxO's denoising software, for example, which is the one that I use, you can get really nice quality photos out of it. It will sharpen them up as well. It will compensate for the flaws of this system. It doesn't go to a very high maximum ISO. I think it's 3200 and an extension to 6400. And when this camera was new, people wouldn't really think of using those. But again, with modern denoising software, I'm quite happy to shoot at that. Although on a day like today, you really don't need it. Flying parallel to you, it's not too bad if they're flying sideways. Okay, so I have some notes so far. I will say that this is quite a frustrating shooting experience for me, coming from a much more modern camera, a camera that's at least a decade newer. It's a very old school way of shooting, not least the very small viewfinder, because this is a crop sensor camera. I am finding that more difficult than I thought to actually focus on things, because I do shoot through my glasses. So that has proven quite difficult. It's also quite old school in how the autofocus works. It's quite sluggish. It doesn't like pulling focus towards the camera. It loves to sit on the background. It really seems to struggle separating subjects from complicated backgrounds. It works seemingly quite well when birds are in the sky against a blue background, but in front of the trees, which is what I'm normally looking for, it is very difficult. It performs a little bit better with birds that are maintaining their distance. So if they're flying horizontally, they're kind of always the same distance away. That seems to work quite well. I'll be curious to see where on those birds it's focused. I'm expecting kind of on the wings, to be honest. We'll see. It's so far proven to be quite difficult, and I'm not certain I'll have any in focus so far. So I think it might be time for lunch. Cold when you're stood in the shade. The wind coming through the windows is quite chilly. Anyway, I've been experimenting with the camera settings, and I found something kind of interesting. Usually on a camera I would use an area or zone autofocus system for birds in flight, and that doesn't work very well on this setup. It just focuses on the background. Instead, by setting it to the middle setting on the camera, which is sort of a central point with some surrounding points, if you can get that central point on the bird, it does perform a bit better, and I may even have a few shots now in focus. But it is a challenge. Keeping the central point on it limits your composition choices, stuff like that. It's difficult, frankly. So maybe this camera would work better with a faster lens. Something like the later version of this lens, or perhaps a Sigma 150 to 600, but they cost over twice as much as this version, so it's more of a £1,000 setup then, rather than a £500 setup, and that's quite a lot more money. So maybe you do just have to compromise on the fact that this camera setup just doesn't work as well for action as you would expect. I think there are better DSLR setups that will perform well for birds in flight, but around this price point, I'm not sure. Something worth mentioning is that with a camera with a mechanical shutter, your autofocus is not working when the shutter is closed. So continuous burst photography is less effective for action shots than shooting in short bursts and allowing time for the camera to catch up. With DSLRs, they have separate autofocus sensors. These can be faster to read out than on a mirrorless camera, because mirrorless cameras' readout speed for autofocus is on the sensor. It's the same as the sensor, and therefore if you've got a slow sensor, your autofocus will be slow when trying to pick the bird back up again when the shutter opens back up. It's why I don't think the Panasonic S5 IIX is that much better for tracking action sequences than this camera is, although it does do better at actually picking the subjects up, I will say that much. So given that it's been over a decade, in fact probably about 15 plus years now since this camera came out, and it is 12.3 megapixels, how does it compare to a modern camera? This is the Nikon Z9, their current flagship. This is 45 megapixels. What's the difference? Well, there's some flamingos behind me. I don't usually take photos of flamingos because they don't really move much, but for this test it's quite useful actually. So here's a couple of shots of flamingos to show the resolution difference between the two. Now, obviously resolution isn't the whole story of the differences between these cameras. They are vastly different in price. They're different in the price when they were new. The Z9 is a flagship camera, the D300s never was. Full frame sensor versus crop sensor, all these sorts of things. It's very, very different, but I thought resolution at least would be somewhat interesting, and it does highlight an advantage to a lower resolution body like this, namely that you don't see optical flaws as easily. The Nikon 180 to 600 that I have for the Z9 suffers from blue fringing, and you can see that in this photo on the Z9. With a high resolution camera, you're going to see optical flaws like that more clearly. So an advantage of a lower resolution body when you're trying to spend less money on your wildlife setup is that you can get away with more affordable lenses that maybe aren't as optically perfect. It's an interesting advantage. Now, affordability is a very different prospect to value for money. This is very affordable, and I know £500 is a lot of money to a lot of people, but it's at the very affordable end of the wildlife camera market. But that's different to value for money. Now, this is very affordable, but for me it would be poor value for money because what I want to photograph is action, and it just doesn't work very well for that. But whether it works for you is going to depend on your context. If you're starting out and you're just getting used to wildlife photography, well, you're probably not going to be trying to shoot birds flying directly at your face all the time. And in that situation, where you're photographing more static subjects, this performs really quite well. And with modern software to offset some of the downsides to an old camera, I think there's a lot of advantages to it. Now, at the lower end of the market in cameras, you get a lot more for each price bracket you go up. So this being £500, if you were able to stretch to about £800, well, you could probably get quite a bit faster a lens or even a faster camera, one or the other. £1,000, well, you could probably swap both out for more advanced models. I think there are some options there. When it comes to the high end of the market, those margins are very, very slim. The differences are not all that great. But at this end, that's something to consider. If you're looking for action photography on a budget, I think you're going to have to stretch a bit more towards £1,000. But if you're happy with more static shots, this is quite good. And it's a nice camera to shoot. It makes a satisfying clunk. It's very ergonomic. Nikon have made very ergonomic cameras for a long time now, and I like shooting it. It has some added benefits outside of wildlife photography too, like it can focus screw drive lenses, which my Z9 can't. And that means that you have access to a bunch of very cheap early autofocus lenses from Nikon. The AFD lenses, things like that. You can pick those up for not a lot of money. They're quite optically good. They just feel a bit plasticky and make quite a lot of noise when they focus. But it's an option and it adds to the affordability of this setup. So a conclusion then about the D300s and the 80-400. It's an interesting setup, and I think it's very hard to put together a wildlife setup for this budget. But I'd be very curious to know your thoughts. I've enjoyed shooting this, except for action photography. I think it's comfortable. I think it's quite an enjoyable system to operate. Obviously, I'm fairly familiar with Nikon cameras. What other options would you recommend? Have you shot anything in this sort of price range before, or slightly above it? What sort of things do you think you could get that would be a bit different, or maybe a bit better suited to your sort of photography? I'd love to know. Now, I'm going to admit that this is about to go back in my bag because the sunset is going to be lovely. I want to go and photograph some birds in flight in some lovely light. So I'm going to get out my modern camera setup. It's not like I see the sun every day, to be honest. So catch you next time.